I want to tell you something about Nathan. Nathan spoke to our group about a year and a half ago, and we knew that he was working on his PhD at that time. And now I want to announce to the group that he hasn't officially walked yet, but he has gone through the committee. The committee has approved his thesis, and he is Dr. Barrick. He is the man. And a little bit of background on Dr. Barrick. He's an international security and international affairs strategic consultant with over 25 years of experience in supporting commanders, policymakers, and business leaders. He is currently the subject matter expert on violent extremist organizations in the Plans Directorate of U.S. Special Operations Command up at MacDill in Tampa. In this capacity, he has been influential in drafting the 2018 National Strategy for Combating Terrorism. You think that's not on the cutting edge? And the military's global campaign plan against violent extremist organizations. So let's give a big hand to Nathan. I know it's not easy to drive down from Tampa. Thanks, Nathan.
Well, first of all, thanks, Gene, for that introduction. Thanks for bringing me back. I'm honored to speak with you guys again. Last time I was here, I remember I had a presentation. We went through that, and then the questions just ranged far and broad. And it was a lot of fun. I had my best song and dance routine on, and apparently it was good enough to get back for an encore. So what I really appreciate about being able to speak with you folks about is I know you put your ideas into action, and that's what I think is great about this organization. I met Gene at the same event a couple of years ago, up with the Global Leadership Coalition and going around to different congressmen, and so that's a very important task. And so that's how I've become acquainted with your group, and I really appreciate what you do as well. What I'd like to do tonight is, I was asked to talk about terrorism, and that's kind of the topic that has been of interest down here, and then I've got a couple comments that I want to make about it, and then briefly, and then we'll open it up for questions. And when we open it up for questions, you know, feel free to throw them at me. The dissertation was on national security strategy. My expertise for the Army was in Russia. I know we got a crisis going on with Iran right now. So, but what I do have to say, because I'm on film, is that you're getting tonight my personal opinions, and what I say does not represent the official views of U.S. Special Operations Command or the Army or the Department of Defense. So I'll just make sure I get that out there. So I put down some cards because otherwise I have a tendency to ramble, as you'll see when I get to the questions. And when the line forms for questions, then I'll know to make my answers brief so we can get on to the next question. But first of all, three things that I want to bring to mind about terrorism. One, I think we need to put this problem into context. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then I want to talk about what we're doing. What's our current strategy? How are we approaching this? And it's what I call the away game. Why we're trying to fight terrorists overseas rather than waiting for an attack. And then the third thing I think I want to look at is where should we go from here? And I think that's particularly important because, again, I know this is a group that puts your ideas and thoughts into motion in letting people know what you think. And so I'd like to give you the benefit of what I think we should be doing next regarding terrorism. So first of all, in terms of putting terrorism into strategic context, and we got to look back before 9/11. And before 9/11, did we have a terrorism problem? Yes, we had a terrorism problem. Many terrorist groups around the world. We'd been attacked a number of times in 2000 with the USS Cole, 1998 with the embassy bombings, Khobar Towers, Beirut, plus not to mention the different hijackings of cruise ships and airliners as well. So we had a terrorism problem, but we did not have military operations being conducted around the world to deal with that problem. And the way we dealt with the problem prior to 9/11 was we looked at it as a diplomatic and law enforcement problem. We privileged State Department negotiations with foreign countries to develop deals with them about sharing information for law enforcement purposes to make it more difficult for known terrorists to travel or conduct business. Basically, law enforcement agencies were hunting them, and intelligence agencies were hunting them. We've learned a lot about Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden since 9/11, but he was a known target, a known threat prior to 9/11, and Al-Qaeda was a known problem. They were responsible for the embassy bombings. And one of the, as we've learned more as a nation after 9/11 about where this problem came from, then we immediately go back to Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden's roots in the Soviet war in Afghanistan and their support for the Mujahideen. And then after the Soviets left Afghanistan, retreated, the civil war in Afghanistan continued. And eventually the Taliban came to power in Afghanistan, and Al-Qaeda was given sanctuary there after they'd started conducting their attacks. So that's part of the context. So what happened after 9/11? And I think that what happened with 9/11, we know it's a tragic terrorist attack. Thousands of Americans lost their lives. Quite shocking for us as a nation to experience. But really, what was the impact? There was a momentary blip on the economy. We responded. We started a war in Afghanistan. Well, we didn't start it. We then responded by invading Afghanistan and beginning a war there. And things have evolved since then. But other than that, what effect has it had on our country? And if we look back, we can compare it to perhaps Pearl Harbor, where this initiates a military action on our part, where we feel there's a war to be won. And yet, in some ways, it seems that this has just kept expanding. It moved to Iraq, and it moved to Somalia, and it moved to Mali, and it moves to Niger. And we've got now folks asking questions like, why are we, Congress is saying, why are we in Yemen? Why are we supporting the Saudi coalition against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and ISIS in Yemen? And the situations with Syria. It just seems like it's gotten more complex since 9/11. But another aspect of that is I think we've lost our strategic perspective of what the threat of terrorism actually means to us. So if we go back to, is the problem worse today? Are we at greater risk of a terrorist attack today than we were prior to 9/11? And it's one of those interesting, it's one of those imponderables. Can we ever really be certain of what the answer is? Because there are some people that are willing to kill themselves to conduct a suicide attack. And there are people that have been dedicated to conducting an attack against the United States for decades, and our country's experienced them. So are we responding as a nation in the right way to this threat? And one of the perspectives that I'm glad you mentioned General Nagata, because General Nagata, he labels himself as as the nation's senior most counterterrorism expert in uniform, which I felt was a great title for him. He is an awesome individual, and I'm glad you got a chance to hear him. I've had the pleasure of engaging with him multiple times over the last year and a half, and he truly is one of our best minds on this topic. And one of the things that he tried to emphasize is looking at it from an actuarial sense. So actuarial science is that's related, it's the math behind insurance and what is the probability of risk. And when you really get down to it, for terrorism and the United States, Americans are more likely to be killed by this television falling over on you than you are to be the victim of a terrorist attack. So why is it such a big national security concern if a television is more dangerous to an American life than a terrorist organization in terms of probabilities and actuarial science? And that immediately goes to the political. We don't want to tolerate, we can't tolerate the risk associated with a terrorist attack. When the terrorist attacks, 9/11 happened, what did we do as a society? There was immediate finger pointing. whose fault is this, which leader's responsible, which policy failed, which organization didn't do their job, and we tore ourselves apart, figuratively, inside the government to try to figure out what caused this, what went wrong, why did we experience this. So it's that aspect of terrorism, it's that self-inflicted wound that we put on ourselves afterwards that's the real risk associated with a terrorist attack. It's the political consequence for a leadership or one of our security organizations that they have to bear the spotlight of somebody saying what went wrong on your watch that we got attacked. And that's very difficult. So we've defaulted as a security organization to say, well, let's just fight them. And nobody can criticize us for doing something because we're fighting an away game. We are prosecuting combat, military operations, we have intelligence operations, we've got everything going on that was going on before 9/11. Maybe we're doing it better, and I would argue that we are doing it better, and we're getting a little more cooperation, and our systems have gotten better, our technology's gotten better, the cooperation of the international community has gotten better. So everything we were doing before 9/11 has gotten better, and maybe it's time to think about whether or not what we're doing right now is the right approach. Some of the things that we've done to try to combat terrorist groups. One, we've tried what's called a decapitation. We look for their key leaders and either kill them or capture them, arrest them, however way you can find them. And what we hope by that is that when we take out that key leader, that organization won't be able to plan attacks. They won't be able to train, that it'll cause the organization to fail, and then we'll be safer. Another thing we do is we look at constraining their resources. We try to cut off their funding. We try to prevent weapons of mass destruction or advanced technologies from falling into their hands. And if we can keep them from that, that lessens their effectiveness. We can't change anything about their ideas, but maybe we can make them less effective if we take away some of their capabilities. And then the other thing we can do is look at what's causing terrorism. Why are they attacking? What are the grievances that they have that motivate them to commit violence? And so we've looked at different programs that we can do, either in the nation building, the development, economic benefits, things to address those socioeconomic conditions that cause people to be upset with where they're at and feel that resorting to violence is a way to solve it. But we have a difficulty with that in that we view nation building, we've typically as a policy, viewed nation building as something expensive that we don't want to get involved in. But everybody agrees, the experts agree, that that's the only way to really resolve the problem, is fix the underlying grievance that causes people to be motivated to violence, and then we won't have to worry about this problem. How that meshes with the extremist ideology is that we're not going to change certain ideologies. They're convinced, and they're not going to change their minds. It'd be kind of like asking Americans to change their minds about being an American. There's just certain core things they're not going to change. But where we see the problem with the terrorism and violence extremist organization is that you have that ideology that tries to manipulate the people with the socioeconomic grievances and convince them to join their cause and commit violence on their behalf. So that's what we're trying to separate there. So shifting to the second topic, this away game and what we're doing. We're trying to restrict their travel. We've got plans between the State Department and other countries. With airports and ports, we've added biometric surveillance techniques to try to make travel difficult. We're still doing direct action with special operations forces and intelligence services. We're building partner capacity in other countries. We're helping them build their law enforcement, their intelligence capabilities, their counterterrorism capabilities so that other countries can solve the problem on their own in their country and don't need us anymore. So we're trying to make capable partners that can fight the fight for us so that we can take a backseat and not fight other people's fights for them. One of the things that we have struggled with is identifying a strategic message to counter the violent extremist ideologies. We're good at pointing the finger and saying their ideology is evil, but we haven't done a very good job of articulating why is our way of life better. We point to it, we'll point to the values of democracy and freedom, but we're not communicating in a way that resonates around the world with the populations that are experiencing those grievances and experiencing government that is not as responsive. And in comparison, ours is wonderful. It raises the question, are we winning this fight? And if we look in certain aspects of it from 9/11 to today, is our world closer to what we view as our strategic objectives in this conflict, or is the world today closer to what Al-Qaeda wanted? Is the world today looking more like what Osama bin Laden's vision of the future was, or is it looking more like what our vision of the future is? And sadly, the expanding conflict in different areas of the world, in 2001, there were only very few areas where there was open conflict going on. Afghanistan was one of them. But there were very few areas where there was this open conflict going on between insurgents, Muslim extremist insurgents and governments. But now they're in multiple different countries. It doesn't look like we're winning in that standpoint. Now, some of the military and intelligence experts will tell you, but wait a second, we've had so many successes. We've disrupted so many times. There hasn't been another 9/11. Great. Is that the only measure of success? Is that how we define winning, that we haven't experienced that type of an attack? And that there's no denying the goodness of that particular argument, but it's very hard logically to figure out, okay, well, what if we did nothing and still had, and we didn't experience a 9/11 attack? Then that would be the same thing. Doing nothing might be just as effective as doing something, because it's kind of hard to prove that negative or prove that that event is related to what you're doing. Because that's the other question is, have we not experienced an attack because of what we're doing, or have we not experienced an attack for other reasons? So it kind of raises that question. And I think in a positive thing, we are regaining our strategic perspective. Men like General Nagata are beginning to shape this and say, hey, is this really the #1 security threat? When General Mattis, or Secretary Mattis, as Secretary of Defense, put out the National Defense Strategy just about a year and a half ago now, switched the priorities. China, Russia, much more important than violent extremist organizations. So I would say we're beginning to get our strategic perspective back in relation to the problem of terrorism. But we're still involved in many conflicts around the world where we're looking at this and saying, the United States has objectives. What are we trying to accomplish? So we still have that political risk as well, that actuarial problem. What if there's another attack? What will the administration say? What will the different security organizations say? Will they be able to stand before the American public and say, we've been doing everything necessary to prevent an attack? This is just one of those things that happens. Are we as a country ready to accept that a terrorist attack is just one of those things that happens, and everybody's doing the right thing, and everybody's doing their job, and we've applied the right amount of resources? Nobody's really still willing to step into that level of, shoulder that mantle of responsibility to say, I'm confident we're doing everything right, and it's just tragic that we experienced this attack, and I don't think we need to change anything in regards to it. That's a very difficult message, even if it's true. So the last thing, what do we do with this? Where do we go from here? And so one of the things I think that we need to do as a people and as a country, especially as our government and the ones making the decisions, we have to keep getting terrorism back into strategic context. We have to get it back into the realm of understanding how significant of a threat is this? What should be the political consequence in America when there's a terrorist attack? What should our response be? And does it really mean that somebody was culpable or that a policy was failing, that some lunatic or some dedicated extremist who is willing to sacrifice themselves conducts an attack? Are those evidence of policy failure or not? So we have to put it into context. And then the other thing I think we need to do is understand where our priorities are in terms of the threats that we face and place our investments appropriately. So if we are appropriately investing towards what we believe our national security threats are, then when one of those lower level threats that isn't getting resourced faces a weakness or a vulnerability and we experience an attack, we're able to respond appropriately, but have the confidence in that our political leaders have the confidence that they can answer and say, we're going to do what we can, but this doesn't need to involve invading another country, or this doesn't need to involve spending $200 billion more in certain programs. It doesn't mean that we have to build twice the number of special operations forces to do this. We need to take a steadier response in how we look at that. And really what that means for our country is it's national resilience. Can we take a punch and recognize that, yeah, that really wasn't so bad. That really wasn't such a bad punch. When we look at the world today, when somebody harms an American, if a terrorist harms an American citizen, has that really elevated the real risks or dangers to American citizens? Because, I mean, if you think about it, who is the greatest danger to an American citizen? Another American citizen. Another element that I think we can do for the future is we need to hand this counterterrorism mission back over to the law enforcement agencies, the State Department, the intelligence community. You know, they're all involved right now, but we need to move the military back from it. And what I mean by that is in some of these operations that we have going around the world, I think we still need to maintain a very highly qualified counterterrorism capability, such as we have in the SEALs and Delta. We need to sustain that. We need to always have that because there are certain places where intelligence officials, law enforcement officials, and diplomats cannot go and from which a threat might come. So we need to have that capability to have the ability to project a certain amount of counterterrorism, direct action, or global strike anywhere on the planet because two people in a garage plotting an attack with an improved munition of some sort are a risk. And who knows where that's going to happen, whether it's in a cave, in the woods, on a boat, we don't know where. We have to retain some capability to be able to respond. One of the things that this involves is looking at, and I know Gene's mentioned, you guys are familiar with this, the authorization for the use of military force, the AUMF. You've probably heard Rand Paul talking about trying to sunset the AUMF. A couple other congressmen have talked about trying to end the AUMF. I think sometimes for them that's more a question of trying to limit the president's power and not really thinking about what the consequences are for terrorism. Some people have been concerned that too many names get added to the list, that they're abusing the congressional authority of the AUMF to target groups that aren't Al-Qaeda. Such as when Obama added the Islamic State to the list of terrorist organizations that the AUMF was authorized for. I would argue the AUMF does need to end. It needs to stop. We need to frame it in a certain context that allows us to move on. But as both General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Secretary Mattis testified when Congress pulled them before the committee to say, what about ending an AUMF? Their response was, you can end it, but you're going to have to replace it with another one that allows us to respond appropriately. And so I think that's what we need to do. We need to have a different AUMF that talks about how we appropriately respond and what our levels of response and authorizations will be and how that's managed. And I think we can do that, of having a system that we can be confident in, that gives the right authorities and the right levels of permission, the right scrutiny to make sure that things are done properly. So in closing, I think when we look at terrorism, it may sound like I'm saying, hey, this is something we just got to accept. And in a way, I am. It's how can we end a war without winning it and without losing it? Can we just declare it over? Can we do that? Does it pass the common sense test? And I don't know if reality is catching up with that. We're beginning to shut down operations. Politicians are getting a little more leery about declaring victory because what happens afterwards. But we have to figure out a way to shift into what our future normal, routine situation is going to be in place terrorism and our counterterrorism policies and strategies in the right place. A large part of that revolves around how are we going to define what our role is in the world. Do we continue to be the world's policeman and try to be the front face of a counterterrorism effort and trying to defeat terrorism wherever it rises? I think that's going to be challenged by, we're in a moment right now where we're experiencing Islamic extremist terrorism. What happens when another political group of terrorists come back? We've experienced leftist terrorism in the past, communist terrorism in the past. We've experienced ethnic-related terrorism in the past. When the terrorism threat shifts to something other than Islamic extremism, will our approach be undermined because we're not thinking through the way we should be responding to these type of threats? So I guess my question would be, do we need to win? Maybe we don't need to win. Maybe this is one where winning is having the right response and the right preparation and the right policy about how we handle a minor problem like terrorism that sometimes grabs a headline. So with that, I'll entertain any questions. And again, you can range them as far as you like as well.
My question is this. In 1999, Bill Clinton did away with the United States Information Agency, essentially passed the buck to the embassies. Do we have any effective means now of reaching out to the world's population to express our values and attempt to win the hearts and minds? How are we giving the moderate mullahs who see their religion being made a mockery of by a couple of fanatics? Who's giving these people the voice?
No, thank you for the question. One of the things that we have recognized is that despite wanting to say having a good strategic communications plan, having a good way of broadcasting our message is something that is important, and we're not doing a good job of it. The State Department has an organization called the Global Engagement Center that is supposed to be crafting what the message is that then gets propagated out to different agencies and organizations to then spread that message. One of the things I think, honestly, that challenges our government's approach to this is Americans have something against propaganda. We inherently view propaganda as wrong. To label somebody as pushing propaganda is considered an insult. And we've lost that art of what propaganda means in an ideological conflict. And I think part of that is because we associate lies and deceit with propaganda, and yet there's propaganda that is a messaging system where you're trying to get your own version out. So I think we have, out of concern that we might be lying, or out of concern that we might push a message that then turns out to be factually wrong, we're not pursuing those as official policies. Now, whether or not the Twitter-based commander-in-chief has changes and influences how tolerant we are about messaging, I mean, I can see that we might change in the future. Or are we going to be more sensitive? I don't know. I don't know whether we're getting less sensitive about messaging or more sensitive about messaging. And so I am concerned about whether or not we have the right capabilities of putting out those messages. And I think what we need to do as a country is get back to having organizations like the U.S. Information Agency. We have some organizations that are contracted, such as Radio Free Europe, that are supported to push messages, and we'll do that from time to time. In different embassies around the world, we have local programs where our embassies can try to establish cultural centers to get out American messaging. One of the strong suits is a lot of people still want to come to America. A lot of people are interested in what does America mean and what does it involve. So I think there's an appetite globally for what America's message is, and what we got to figure out is, are we willing to have an official voice, or are we just going to leave it to Hollywood and the rest of the cable news networks and the internet? Maybe we don't need to have an official version.
Dr. Barrick.
Still feels good.
This might come across as kind of simplistic based upon what you've been discussing, but don't we have in this country defense factories, war-making factories in nearly every state? I mean, I guess I just want your thoughts on this. Isn't it set up so that we need war? Because if we don't, what do we do with all those boots we make, or bullets, or gyroscopes for jet fighters? We got to keep making them, and they're just not going into a warehouse there. We need a war to use them. And I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
That's not a simple question, but you knew that when you asked. The military-industrial complex. I think that's really what you're talking about there. And interestingly enough, so the topic that I did my dissertation on was the evolution of national security strategy-making institutions and their impact on grand strategy. You know, big mouthful, but really what I looked at is how have we evolved in the military and the government of how do we make strategy? And one of the key moments that I looked at was President Eisenhower's warning, his farewell address right before Kennedy's inauguration, and Eisenhower warns about the military-industrial complex. And I dug into that because I want to understand what did he mean? What did Eisenhower mean? You know, coming from that man's perspective as the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe for the D-Day invasion and finishing off Nazi Germany, to being president, what did he mean by the military-industrial complex? And so one aspect of this is it gets into the bomber gap with the Soviet Union, and that the president knew that the Soviets were not capable. Yet the defense industry and some of the generals and admirals that were not privileged to the highly classified information that the president had, they believed that we needed, in this Cold War environment, we needed to make sure that we had military parity and, in fact, dominance over the Soviet Union. So the military was pushing Congress to approve armaments acquisitions that the President Eisenhower knew that we did not need. And that was his dilemma. How do I protect this intelligence yet make the right choice? And we can look back on it and say, hey, we wish you'd push back a little more or not. You know, it's very hard. You can imagine coming from his background on whether or not he was going to make it look like he was exposing America to risk when actually he may have had the confidence of the American people to be able to make that call where we might trust such a leader. No president today, nor in our foreseeable future, is likely to have the same stature or credibility in making a national security decision and an estimation of the threat than Eisenhower. A lot of people have wanted generals for presidents, but we may not see one anytime soon. So I think there is an element within our market-based economy that drives weapons production, that wants to sell it, that wants to see advancement. And when we reduce the amount of purchases, they find ways to increase the costs so that they still make the money. It is a challenge. It's something that's extremely difficult. And I think the only way that we are going to be able to grasp that or keep that under control is to make sure that we have the right civil-military relationship in our country where there's civilian oversight that is informed by strategic vision to say, these are threats we need to be concerned about, these are threats we do not, and we don't need this weapon system, or we only need this much. And if we can't provide that, we're going to be facing that challenge of, are the militarists pushing wars to make money? And this is not anything new. This is not new to this era. It is not new. It wasn't new in Eisenhower's. And in fact, one of the concerns between World War I and World War II, it was very popular in American culture at the time to be very suspicious of the armaments industry because they blamed World War I on military armaments manufacturers. So it's nothing new, and unless we can keep a control on it as a people, as a vigilant people, I think that's really the only path we have. Next question, please.
When the intelligence community as a whole has looked at the Iraq and Afghan wars and done an assessment. Has there been an in-depth assessment of where we would be globally if neither one of these wars, or one of them, hadn't been taken on? So.
There's a reluctance, I think, to engage in what we call counterfactuals, which is what if this hadn't happened? Where would we see it today? And the people that make decisions get invested in those decisions. The people that advise the decision makers get invested in their advice, and they're not willing to look at advice they've given and question it and challenge it, challenge your assumptions, and is it possible that you gave bad advice? Very difficult for our politicians, especially when we as a culture want to keep sticking a microphone in their face and say, answer for what you did. Do you think you did the wrong decision? Are you reconsidering it now? And it takes a special character to be able to admit fault and move on. And I think especially in a public figure, maybe it should be one of those criteria that we look at in electing an official is maybe we need someone, rather than someone who is perfect and has a perfect background and never made mistakes, but rather somebody who has made mistakes and has a healthy, constructive way of acknowledging it and moving on from them. But that's in our choice of how we choose leaders to get at that. I think it'd be a great counterfactual fiction story to write. I think what might even be better is for us to look to the future, and one of the intelligence techniques that analysts have is called backcasting. And what this is that an intelligence analyst, when they're having difficulty trying to predict the future, they'll instead write the story from a future perspective, looking backward to explain how they got to that point. And so that's where you can kind of get into this, well, what if we did something different? Than an intelligence analyst taking a future point can say 10 years from now, US-Russia relations, if there hadn't been this situation in the US and we took this path, could we have repaired the relationship, and where would the relationship be 10 years from now? That'd be that type of analysis and looking at that. Or taking the current situation and 10 years from now going, hey, where did US-Russia relations end up because of what happened? I think that kind of technique might open it. But you're right. We have to, before we jump in and make decisions, think through what the consequences are. And when we look at the US response to Afghanistan, we went from, I mean, there were probably only a handful of people in the United States. Like when 9/11 happened, I was at the Fort Leavenworth, the Command and General Staff College. And there's 1,000 Army majors at this school, 13 in every classroom. So I'm looking around at 15 classmates. Out of 15 classmates, Army majors in 2001, only 2 of us knew where Afghanistan was. So, and yet from 9/11 to before the end of October, the United States is projecting force into Afghanistan. You know, maybe 7 weeks to a country that we didn't really understand is too quick to launch an attack. And we didn't get bin Laden until what, nearly 10 years later? So maybe when we think about how long, maybe now when we can look back and say, you know what, we hunted bin Laden for 10 years, maybe in hindsight we can say we probably didn't need to rush into Afghanistan in 7 weeks. Maybe next time we experience something like this, we can take it a little slower and make sure we get the right response rather than a rapid response. And that's going to be incumbent upon us as a people to ensure that a media demand for public accountability does not drive a response before our leaders are ready to act.
Sure. Following up on your comments about the need to balance and put that strategies in context, as I recall, and I just went back and looked it up, in the 9/11 Commission report published July 2004, the last 2 chapters are what to do, global strategy, how to do it, a different way of organizing the government. And I recall at the time, I was actually in DC, like Steve was, attending workshops on going to the Senate legislators on how to balance that. And what they were talking about was, yes, we have to reorganize internally. That's what the whole DHS came out of it. But then we lost sight of that need to engage, as you were talking about there. One of the things that I learned in that was talking about the 3 Ds: defense, diplomacy, and development. In fact, actually, I happen to know where Afghanistan was because in July 2001, I was sitting in Bishkek, Kyrgyz Republic, with President Akiyev on a foreign direct investment by USAID of how to train the local economy in such things like bookkeeping and market prediction, because you're going from a central command where you do everything the government tells you to produce to how do I do a marketing plan? How do I gauge what the market needs are, et cetera? How do I bring my products to market to meet a demand? That was education that at the business level, they didn't have. And so it was a recognition that development was a part. So how, going forward, are we actually looking at strategically our funds to go across defense, diplomacy, and development? How do we get there?
Yeah, no, great comments. The 9/11 Commission report is absolutely worth reading, and when you want to look at something in terms of, it's I think we sometimes we're very critical of our government, I think, as a citizenry, and I think that's ingrained in us. There's some positive aspects to that. There's some negative aspects to that. One of the positive aspects, or one of the negative aspects, is I think sometimes we lose sight of some of the things our government actually gets right. And the 9/11 Commission is one that really drew, trying to get at what identified the problem. And some of the stuff's like old news now, that the FBI and the CIA were not sharing information, and they've, news that it hasn't been fixed completely, but it is much better. But in terms of your question about defense, diplomacy, and development, we do not yet have that imbalance. And I think that's illustrated, one, by what I know this group's been involved with the past couple of years, is the Trump administration's trying to cut funding for the State Department. I think anybody that's an expert in this field, and anybody who's even looked at this for a while, realize that that doesn't sound like a good idea. It's hard to imagine what constitutes justification for that concept, because everybody has resisted it. Everybody on the development side, everybody in the diplomacy side, everybody on the defense side has resisted cutting that funding, that we need to get it in balance. I think the piece that's not so solid is the development side, where that, I think, as a citizenry, we have a much more mixed attitudes about. And a piece of that is that we believe true success in economic development comes when people do that for themselves, because then they're personally invested in it. So how much is a hand out? Let's use the Obama expression, a hand out versus a hand up. We have various different ways of looking at development globally, and whether or not that is their responsibility, whether it's our responsibility, whether it's burden shared. This is a difficult topic in terms of trying to figure out what the priorities are. For myself, my personal opinion is I think we probably need to do a little bit more of letting people develop themselves and let the global market kind of bear some of that, because one of the things I look at is our own internal infrastructure. There's things here that if we don't fix aging infrastructure within the United States, we won't be able to project development capability 20 years from now. We will be in need of international development assistance to get our infrastructure up. So we can either do that for ourselves now or become an international basket case in a few decades, if we keep building other people up before ourselves. So it's I kind of look at it, I relate that to the life-saving. When you're a lifesaver, one of the principles, what's the first rule of life-saving? Don't become a victim. That's the first rule. It's not immediately sacrifice everything to go get that person that's drowning. The first rule of life-saving is don't become a victim. And I think when we look at our international development policies, we got to be a little bit smarter about this in terms of the first rule of international development should be don't become a victim of lack of development. Yes, sir.
Yes, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. I guess my question actually kind of tails in to that last one a little bit. In 2007, General Petraeus took over for ISAF, And his big initiative, or what became, revitalization of his initiative, was COIN. And what I haven't heard you use the word is counterinsurgency. So I was just curious if the department, what the thought leadership is, where their stance is on that now. It seems like that's kind of died away almost with General Petraeus's star a little bit. I don't know if that was on purpose or how that came about, but that was kind of the basis of my question. And then follow-on question would be, I've heard recently that SOF has gotten up to, I think, around 70,000. Is there any discussion at the thought leadership level to try and bring that back down to a level that was originally intended, I guess, or is that the new status quo?
Okay, no, thanks for your questions. And I'll remind again, I'm giving my opinion. I'm being pretty opinionated, but I think that's why you invited me down here, was to give my opinion. I'm actually a little, I tried not to be a hard line on opinions, because I always want to be open to hearing ideas. And one of the things I do myself is always challenge my assumptions, always review. Why do I believe this, and is it still true? Is it still right to think this way? So I'm giving my opinion on your questions, and not necessarily reflecting those of the thought leadership of the department. So I'll just caveat that. So COIN, this actually is a very, very important aspect of, I think, the way ahead. And you've put your finger on it. If I could talk for another hour, I'd probably have gotten into it. So it's telling the difference between who is a terrorist and who is an insurgent. So who is that extremist that's just trying to cause violence, and who is that person that's trying to has resorted to violence to fix what we might label a legitimate grievance? And that's where we get into the insurgency. So insurgents are people who are trying to affect a political outcome by resorting to violence because other methods have failed. A terrorist is someone who uses violence to have a political effect. They're not really too concerned about what system governs that. So one of the things that we need to do in order to move ahead on our counterterrorism policy is distinguish between who are insurgents that need a different approach, that isn't just decapitation, and maybe it's bringing their leaders into mediation with the governments that they've got a problem with and trying to reach an alternative solution that doesn't require violence. So that's insurgency. And so I think COIN and counterinsurgency is one of those important aspects of the way ahead is, let's correctly identify what those problems are, and if it's not let's not call an insurgency a terrorist problem. And so let's get away from the terrorist aspect of it and say, all right, this is an insurgency. Now what are our political interests here rather than security interests? And how can we best represent us as a country in what we believe about democracy and what we believe about how people reach political decisions without violence, as if we were a good example of that. But focus on insurgencies in terms of how do we separate who the enemy is and how we handle them. So I think the COIN aspect is something that's still very important. It has not lost its shine because Petraeus lost his, but it is, I think it's still one of those evolving concepts. Now, what's perhaps even more important about that is that we don't do what we've done in the past, which is when we move to the next war, what we think the next war is going to be, that we forget how to do COIN, because we've learned a lot of valuable lessons over the last 15 years that we do not need to lose or relearn again in the future. But when we focus on conventional war or strategic war, that we don't lose our COIN capabilities. And then to SOF, I haven't heard anybody talking about reducing SOF. And I think when we look at having a lighter footprint, wanting to engage more carefully, wanting to understand culture, like if we move down this piece of let's understand problems better before we move in, maybe that calls for more SOF. So I only see SOF continuing to grow, but whether or not that particular element of SOF that focuses on counterterrorism direct action, that's probably too big right now. It's probably going to reduce a little bit, I would imagine, my prediction, that it'll reduce a little bit, but SOF as a whole in terms of Green Berets, I think we'll see a growth in that as we try to understand our world better. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
First, congratulations on your doctorate.
Thank you.
And I'd like you to comment on the fact that we have an all-volunteer military now that affects a very small percentage of the families. And so there's very little political risk for mission creep, whereas if we had a mandatory conscription and it affected almost every family in the U.S., it'd be very hard, much more higher political price to send our military in all sorts of places.
Nope. All right, thank you. So I'll answer your question first. This is interesting because this is one of those, this is actually one element of the dissertation I got into a little bit, and the more I saw about it, the more some of this it drew my interest more, and I had to be careful that it didn't distract me from what I was trying to do and staying on topic in my dissertation. But what your question really goes to is kind of our civil-military relations and what our strategic culture is in a relationship with the military. And one of the things I think is interesting, and I think this is something that if you think about it a little bit, it might generate some concern. So the government institution that is most respected by American citizens today is the military. I mean, that's polls, you know, we still have an element of our society that has some anti-military sentiment, but as a whole, the organization, the part of the government that has the most respect to the public is the military. The part of the government that has the least respect from the people is Congress. The organization responsible for maintaining overwatch over the military is Congress. So you have the least respected institution responsible for overwatching the most respected institution. I don't know how long that continues in the way that we all know that it should. At what point does the military's oath of defending a constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, when do they begin to change how we identify what a domestic threat is? Right now, we have the luxury of being able to be confident, I think, in our military professionalism and ethics, that I think the leadership of our military operates and believes in a certain way, and that we don't need to worry about it. And perhaps we are so confident and so trusting in that professionalism, you know, for a lot of veterans, it's because we understand that professionalism. And people look to us for guidance and view of, hey, is our military still being professional? You were military, are they still like you were? And so we have that confidence. But I think that is a situation we should not take for granted. I think we need to look at that smartly. We need to look at that wisely and say, how do we keep the right strategic culture in our country? We're looking at a society that has fewer and fewer attachments to the military. Our population has expanded. There's common sense reasons why there's a smaller element of the military in our society. One of the things we have to note is our founders designed it that way. The Constitution says we have to have a Navy. It only says we need to raise and support an Army when we need one. So as a country, our founding basis is to have a small military footprint because we're distrusting of a standing military. We have a standing military right now. It's not what the founders intended. The current military is not what the founders intended. And we have to understand that. And just because we have people look at frustrated with military in terms of the budget and the funding. And one of the good things about that frustrating budget is that it's a 2-year cycle. The reason it's a 2-year cycle goes back to the Constitution. That's the last sop the current military has to the constitutional basis and values of what the military's role in society is that 2-year budget. So that's the last thing we want to change, because then we'll have no ties between what the founders intended for our military and the current military we have today. So tough question. I personally, I'd love universal military conscription, because then everybody would have a certain understanding. We might be able to, I think there's a place where you tap the energy of our people at a certain age bracket there in the late teens to early 20s and send them abroad. You know, we've always believed that the best representation of America is American citizens. What best than to take our youth and show them to the world and give them that experience and make them wiser people for the whole. The problem is when you implement a system like that, it sounds like the Soviet Union and the Komsomol pioneers. So we have to come up with different slogans, but I think there's a benefit there. I think we could do great good with it. I'm skeptical that we would ever pass such a program.
Okay, I attended a TEDx here in Sarasota where people went into Africa and to help build up the area, and they had them plant the crops, corn and things like that, and they didn't consult the local people because the monsoons came and washed everything away, and then they had nothing, and when you're helping redevelop these countries, how can you avoid disasters like that?
And then to your question about how do we understand cultures better so that we make the right oh, you said it right in the back, so that we don't make bad investments. And I think getting to one of these ideas is we got to get more Americans out into the world, understand our world better, whether that's an improvement in our education system. I think that's one of the places that I would take some of the money that we are spending on nuclear weapons or aircraft carriers and shift it instead into education, because I would rather, I think we will be a safer country if 100 million Americans had a better sense of world geography than an additional aircraft carrier. And I bet that's probably a pretty good trade right there. So the way we prevent those mistakes is understanding our world better. And I think, mentioning if we have increased SOF as the military component of getting out and trying to understand before we get in there, we need to empower the diplomats and USAID to better understand our world. But I think even more important, and that's why what you do here is so important, and why I thank you for what you're doing, is because you're being a part of that, of educating your fellow citizens on what this world is about and what our real issues are. And so thank you, Gene, for letting me be here, part of this.